November 12, 1944. 0400 hours. The treacherous shores of Volkov Island. The modified Goliath-class heavy cruisers that patrolled the murky waters that frigid dawn carried a weapon that would fundamentally transform naval siege warfare in the Pacific. The engineers called them Deepstrike Vessels after their ability to unleash unseen devastation from below. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1944. The war in the Pacific had devolved into a grinding, brutal slog, each island a blood-soaked testament to unwavering resolve on both sides. On the heavily fortified island of Volkov, Admiral Ruji Sato, a stern man with an unblemished record, surveyed his defensive perimeter. Volkov, a critical strategic point in the Dragon's Tooth defensive line, had been transformed into an impenetrable bastion over years of meticulous engineering. Its shore batteries, carved deep into volcanic rock, were legendary, having repelled numerous Allied attempts to land and establish a foothold. Sato's forces, the formidable Iron Typhoon fleet and its accompanying garrison, were well-provisioned and fiercely loyal. He had full confidence that Volkov would hold, a testament to the unyielding spirit of his nation. Unknown to him, however, far beyond the reach of his formidable reconnaissance, a radical new concept was being perfected, a desperate measure born from the sheer impossibility of conventional victory. In a hidden research complex beneath the desolate plains of the Argent Coast, a collective of brilliant, albeit unorthodox, scientists and engineers worked tirelessly. At its helm was Professor Elara Vance, a visionary physicist whose theories often bordered on the fantastical, yet consistently yielded groundbreaking results. Their top-secret initiative, codenamed Project Leviathan, was a gamble of epic proportions, authorized directly by the Allied Supreme Commander, General Alden Thorne. Thorne, a man known for his audacious strategies and willingness to embrace the unconventional, understood that the traditional naval blockades and bombardment tactics against targets like Volkov were simply too costly in lives and resources. Professor Vance's theoretical breakthroughs in hydro-acoustic resonance and targeted subterranean disruption offered a glimmer of hope where all other avenues had led to stalemate. The core idea was simple, yet terrifyingly complex: to create a weapon that could bypass traditional defenses entirely, striking from where it was least expected. The initial prototypes were crude, massive cylindrical devices designed to be launched from modified vessels. Each unit, packed with an experimental sonic vibration charge, was intended to travel undetected beneath the ocean floor, penetrating defensive structures from below. The concept faced immense skepticism from conventional military minds. "You expect us to believe," one admiral had scoffed during a tense briefing, "that a glorified diving bell will crack fortifications that have withstood weeks of continuous artillery fire?" Yet, Thorne, swayed by Vance's passionate explanations and the dire strategic outlook, provided the necessary resources and political cover. The pressure was immense. Failure would not only be a catastrophic waste of dwindling resources but a profound blow to Allied morale. Vance and her team pushed past countless setbacks, the air in their subterranean lab thick with the smell of ozone and burnt wiring, driven by the knowledge that every minute counted. Volkov Island represented the ultimate test, an objective deemed practically unconquerable by any other means. The fate of the Pacific theater, and perhaps the war itself, hinged on their success. The technical challenges facing Project Leviathan were monumental. The primary obstacle was the unpredictable nature of the ocean floor and the precise guidance required to navigate the sonic vibration charges to their intended targets. Dr. Vance's team experimented with various propulsion systems, eventually settling on a unique bioluminescent tracking system that exploited minute variations in the seabed's magnetic field. This allowed the Deepstrike vessels to move with an eerie, almost organic stealth, rendering them invisible to conventional sonar. The charges themselves were another marvel of engineering. Unlike traditional explosives, which relied on brute force, these devices generated highly concentrated, low-frequency sonic waves designed to resonate with and destabilize geological structures. The theory was that a precisely placed charge wouldn't explode outwards, but rather cause internal fracturing and collapse, turning rock into rubble from the inside out. This kind of targeted destruction was unprecedented. Meanwhile, on Volkov, Admiral Sato remained confident, even as Allied aerial reconnaissance increased in intensity. His intelligence reports indicated no unusual Allied fleet movements that could signal a new offensive against his island fortress. He believed the enemy was merely softening up his defenses with more persistent bombing runs, a prelude to another failed landing attempt. Sato's men were hardened veterans, their resolve reinforced by the seemingly impenetrable defenses they occupied. They had dug deeper, installed more layered defenses, and perfected their ambush tactics within the island's intricate cave systems. Their anti-aircraft guns, continuously upgraded, made flying over Volkov a suicidal endeavor for Allied pilots. The admiral often walked the perimeter himself, a stoic figure inspecting every detail, his presence a constant source of assurance to his troops. He truly believed Volkov was invulnerable, a belief shared by every soldier under his command. Back at the Argent Coast facility, the final Deepstrike prototype was undergoing its ultimate test. A scaled-down model of Volkov's primary defense complex had been meticulously recreated in an immense underground water tank. Professor Vance and her team watched with bated breath as the miniature Deepstrike vessel was launched. It moved silently, a barely perceptible ripple on the water's surface indicating its passage. Moments later, a faint tremor ran through the simulated bedrock, followed by a sickening creak. The miniature fortress, a symbol of impregnable defense, began to sag, then fracture, finally collapsing into a heap of underwater debris. A collective gasp, then a surge of triumphant cheers, erupted in the control room. The theory had worked. The weapon was viable. General Thorne, present for the demonstration, allowed himself a rare, grim smile. "Prepare for deployment," he ordered, his voice echoing with a newfound determination. Volkov awaits its reckoning. The secret order was now a deadly reality, poised to change the course of the war in a way no one, especially not Admiral Sato, could possibly imagine. The element of complete surprise was their greatest asset, and they intended to wield it with devastating effect against the unsuspecting defenders of Volkov. The launch of the Deepstrike vessels was shrouded in absolute secrecy. Under the cloak of a severe Pacific storm, a small, specialized task force, spearheaded by the modified Goliath-class cruisers, set sail towards Volkov. These cruisers, stripped of most of their conventional weaponry, now housed immense launch tubes below their waterline, disguised as fuel tanks. The crew, a hand-picked assortment of sailors and Project Leviathan technicians, understood the gravity of their mission. Communication was strictly forbidden, and every precaution had been taken to ensure no signal, no hint of their true purpose, could reach enemy ears. Commander Thorne, observing from the flagship, felt the weight of hundreds of thousands of lives on his shoulders. This was a gamble of unprecedented scale. Failure would not only mean the loss of the vessels and their crews, but potentially prolong the war by months, even years. On Volkov Island, Admiral Sato's forces were on high alert, but for conventional threats. Heavy rains lashed the island, reducing visibility and making aerial patrols impossible. Sato considered it a minor inconvenience, perhaps even an advantage, as it would hamper any potential Allied air assault. His radar operators reported only the distant, occasional echoes of Allied scout vessels, well within expected patrol routes. The Japanese garrison settled into a routine of vigilance, confident that their fortifications would withstand any storm, natural or military. Within the deep bunkers, soldiers played games, wrote letters home, or simply tried to sleep through the incessant roar of the wind and rain, oblivious to the silent, unseen danger approaching beneath the waves. The belief in their island's invincibility was almost religious. As the task force reached the designated launch zone, approximately 50 miles from Volkov, Professor Vance, who had insisted on being present, gave the final command. With a low hydraulic hiss, the first Deepstrike vessel slid silently into the churning ocean. Followed by a second, then a third, and a fourth. Each vessel, pre-programmed with precise targeting coordinates, vanished into the dark depths, guided by its advanced bioluminescent navigation system. The journey beneath the ocean floor was slow, deliberate, and fraught with peril. The team back on the flagship monitored faint telemetry signals, tiny blips of light on their screens that indicated the vessels were on course, tunneling through the seabed like metallic moles. The tension in the control room was palpable, every breath held as they watched the dots crawl closer and closer to their designated targets, the foundations of Volkov's main artillery batteries, its command bunker, and its critical underground supply depots. The storm above raged, mirroring the quiet, internal storm of apprehension and hope within the hearts of the Allied command. The clock was ticking, and Volkov was completely unaware of the subterranean specter closing in. Beneath the seabed, the Deepstrike vessels continued their inexorable journey. Dr. Vance watched the telemetry with a mixture of professional detachment and gut-wrenching anxiety. The environmental conditions were worse than anticipated. The deep sea currents, magnified by the storm above, threatened to push the relatively small vessels off course. Each correction required a burst of power, draining the limited reserves of their experimental batteries. The navigation was painstaking, relying on incredibly sensitive magnetometers to map the mineral composition of the rock they tunneled through. A single large, unforeseen geological anomaly, a massive vein of basalt or a deep thermal vent, could throw off a vessel, rendering it useless or, worse, causing it to detonate prematurely. Failure at this stage would be catastrophic. The Allied task force had committed entirely to this single, radical action. There was no conventional fallback plan ready to execute. On Volkov Island, Admiral Sato was presiding over a routine inspection of his main command bunker, a vast, subterranean complex carved directly into the core of the island's dormant volcano. The bunker was a marvel of civil engineering, its concrete walls reinforced with steel and layered with impact-absorbing materials, designed to withstand the heaviest naval ordnance. Sato felt completely safe here, secure in the knowledge that no bomb, no shell, could reach them. The rhythmic roar of the storm was the only sound audible, a comforting white noise that masked the subtle, almost imperceptible tremors beginning far beneath the island's crust. Japanese engineers on the lower levels occasionally reported unusual, localized seismic activity, small vibrations that were quickly dismissed as minor aftershocks from previous heavy bombardments or attributed to the sheer force of the storm. However, one keen-eared technician in the signals unit, Kenji, noticed a faint, high-pitched thrum in the hydrophone readings, a sound too rhythmic to be natural. He filed a report, but the commander, preoccupied with maintaining readiness against an anticipated surface attack, glanced at the data and wrote it off as interference from the heavy weather. Kenji, though, was unnerved. The frequency was wrong for natural tremor, it sounded engineered. He spent his long watch trying to isolate the strange signal, a ghostly pulse that seemed to be approaching their position from deep below. His warnings, though quietly insistent, were lost in the noise of the command center, a tragic oversight driven by overconfidence in their conventional defenses. The Deepstrike vessels were now within the final perimeter, approximately a kilometer beneath the command bunker and directly under the primary artillery battery foundations. The hour of reckoning was fast approaching, signaled only by a subtle, ignored hum in the ocean's depths. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence in the flagship's control room was so complete it was deafening. Professor Vance had given the final command. No grand countdown, no fanfare, just a single, terse word, execute. She and the crew watched the telemetry fade as the Deepstrike vessels switched from navigation mode to activation mode, initiating the sonic vibration charges. There would be no immediate, visible explosion. Instead, the process was designed to be insidious, a localized, internal earthquake. The low-frequency sonic waves would spread out from the charge sites, matching the resonant frequency of the crystalline structure of the volcanic rock itself. It was less a blast, and more a perfect, invisible harmonic that would tear the island's geological foundations apart. The effect was meant to be total structural collapse, specifically targeting the engineered weak points of the Japanese fortifications, the load-bearing columns, the deep concrete anchors, and the natural fault lines that had been exploited for the bunker construction. On Volkov, the realization of danger was terrifyingly swift. It began not with a roar, but with a sickening groan that resonated through the rock and bone. Deep within the command bunker, the sound was muffled but undeniable, a primordial sound of the earth itself complaining. Admiral Sato, who was reviewing supply manifests, felt the floor heave, not in a sharp jolt like a conventional earthquake, but in a prolonged, nauseating wave. Then, the ceiling cracked, a long, jagged line that raced across the concrete overhead. Within seconds, the power failed, plunging the vast bunker into utter blackness, relieved only by the frantic flicker of emergency lamps. Panic erupted. Men who had stood firm against fire and steel were now completely undone by the sudden, inexplicable movement of the ground beneath them. The primary target, the massive artillery batteries facing the sea, crumbled first. Designed to withstand horizontal attacks, their foundations were utterly unprepared for an assault that came from a kilometer straight down. The ground beneath the massive gun carriages turned to liquefaction, and the guns, moments before symbols of Japanese defiance, tipped forward and disappeared into colossal, smoking sinkholes. The collapse was not caused by fragments of a shell, it was the entire structural integrity of the foundation failing simultaneously. On the surface, the storm continued to rage, concealing the horror below, but the island's seismic profile had been irrevocably altered. Admiral Sato's attempt to restore order was futile. Communications were shredded as cables snapped, and the complex network of tunnels and passages that had been their strength now became a labyrinth of death, collapsing one section at a time as the island's core shifted under the unseen, relentless sonic assault. The shockwave, or rather, the wave of resonant geological failure, was not instantaneous, it was a sustained, localized destruction. It lasted less than 3 minutes, but in that time, Volkov Island's elaborate defenses were systemically dismantled from the bedrock up. The effect was highly localized to the reinforced military structures. Civilian areas and smaller, non-fortified outposts experienced only severe, but survivable, tremors. This precision was Project Leviathan's deadliest secret. It targeted engineered resilience, turning the Japanese investment in concrete and steel against itself. The heavy, rigid structures were the first to shatter as the sonic waves found the stress points inherent in man-made construction. From the Allied flagship, Commander Thorne observed the island's seismic profile jump wildly, then slowly settle into a pattern of internal instability. There was no mushroom cloud, no massive explosion to confirm success, only the readings that indicated a profound, subterranean shift. Hours later, as the storm began to abate, the first reconnaissance flights approached the island. What they saw was not the smoking ruins of a surface battle, but a strange, silent devastation. Key strategic locations, the central airfield, the primary barracks, and most importantly, the entrances to the main bunker network, were all marked by massive, localized depressions and fissures, silent witnesses to the ground giving way. The heavy naval guns, once the island's teeth, were gone. Admiral Sato and a handful of his senior officers managed to claw their way out of a secondary, partial collapse, emerging into a landscape utterly transformed. The once sturdy command complex was now a tangled mess of broken concrete and twisted metal, inaccessible and useless. Sato's face, normally a mask of iron control, was etched with confusion and a growing terror. This was not the result of a bombardment he understood. There were no massive shell craters, no shrapnel. The destruction was surgical, yet total. He sent out desperate signals, not for reinforcements, but for a damage assessment, trying to comprehend the nature of the attack. His remaining forces, scattered and disoriented, now faced a new and terrifying reality. Their fortress was built on sand, and the enemy possessed a weapon that could liquefy the very earth beneath them. The unyielding confidence that had defined Volkov's defense was shattered by a weapon they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't fight. The strategic implications of the Deepstrike's success were immediate and profound. General Thorne wasted no time. With the primary coastal defenses neutralized and the Japanese command structure crippled, the vulnerability of Volkov was exposed. He immediately launched the invasion fleet, but with a crucial difference: the landing was preceded not by massive artillery barrages, which would have been futile against the remaining pocket defenses, but by a series of pinpoint strikes utilizing the remaining Deepstrike vessels against suspected secondary bunker locations. The goal was to continue the psychological warfare, reinforcing the terror of the unseen weapon. The Japanese defenders, who had laughed off conventional attacks, were now paralyzed by fear. Every tremor, every creak in the rock, signaled a potential new collapse. Admiral Sato, operating from a makeshift command post, struggled to formulate a defense. His remaining forces were prepared for a fight, but they were trained for a fixed defense, the kind of battle that relied on their fortified positions. Stripped of those positions, and demoralized by the knowledge that the enemy could strike anywhere, anytime, from below, their cohesion rapidly dissolved. Reports filtered back of men abandoning deep tunnels, preferring the relative exposure of the surface, where at least they could see the enemy. The psychological damage inflicted by Project Leviathan was proving to be more devastating than the structural damage. Sato realized that his island, designed to be their ultimate shield, had become a prison and a tomb. The Allied landing on Volkov was met with disorganized and fragmented resistance. Instead of the expected brutal, multi-day battle for every meter of sand, the troops encountered bewildered, shell-shocked defenders. Many Japanese units were found still trapped in partially collapsed structures, having surrendered not to Allied soldiers, but to the crushing power of the earth. The sheer impossibility of the destruction defied all military logic known to the Japanese command. General Tanaka, the overall commander of the Dragon's Tooth defense line, received Sato's fragmented reports with disbelief. He demanded photographic evidence, unable to reconcile the idea of an island fortress being defeated without a single ship being sunk or a significant aerial bombardment. The legend of Volkov's invincibility was not just a point of pride, it was the linchpin of their entire defensive strategy in the region. That single, secret order, executed in the dead of night, had not just taken an island, it had introduced a terrifying new dimension to warfare, one that Japan was utterly unprepared to counter. The capture of Volkov Island, which military planners had estimated would cost tens of thousands of casualties and take months, was achieved in less than 4 days. The primary factor was not superior numbers or courage, but the absolute psychological and structural incapacitation of the defenders by the Deepstrike vessels. The war was far from over, but the strategic landscape had been irrevocably altered. General Thorne stood on the newly secured cliffs of Volkov, looking out over the sea, the storm now long gone. He knew that the war machine of the opposing force, built on the rock-solid foundations of heavily fortified, static defenses, was now vulnerable everywhere. The secret weapon had solved the seemingly unsolvable problem of cave and concrete warfare in the Pacific. Professor Vance, flown in to assess the damage, stood beside him. She was not jubilant, but somber. "It is terrifying, General," she observed, looking at the fractured ground. "We didn't just breach their defenses, we broke their faith in the ground beneath their feet." Thorne nodded. That was the essence of it. The weapon had attacked the very concept of defense. News of Volkov's sudden collapse spread like wildfire through the remaining Japanese garrisons on other islands. Reports indicated a massive uptick in desertions and a noticeable decrease in the fanatical resistance that had characterized earlier battles. Soldiers began to question the safety of their own bunkers, realizing the concrete shield that was supposed to protect them could now become a lethal trap. The secret of Project Leviathan remained the most closely guarded Allied secret until after the war, but its effects were undeniable. It created a panic among the Japanese high command, forcing them to divert massive resources into developing countermeasures against an enemy they couldn't define. They ordered geological surveys and counterseismic listening posts, wasting precious manpower and materials on defending against a threat they never truly understood, let alone countered effectively. The Iron Typhoon had been broken, not by shellfire, but by science applied to the very foundation of their resistance. Volkov Island became the silent monument to this revolution, the turning point where the war moved beyond conventional military thought. The weapon Japan never expected, and couldn't stop, was not a gun or a bomb, but the targeted manipulation of the Earth itself, shattering their defense system and their spirit in one secret, devastating order. The intelligence gathered from the swift, almost bloodless victory at Volkov Island was invaluable. Allied engineers and geologists pored over the shattered remains of the island's core defenses, confirming Professor Vance's theories about hydro-acoustic resonance and structural collapse. The key takeaway was that the rigidity and mass of the Japanese fortifications, their intended strength, were precisely what made them vulnerable to the Deepstrike vessels. Concrete, steel, and tightly packed rock transmitted the destructive low-frequency waves efficiently, leading to rapid, internal disintegration. Conversely, softer, less engineered targets absorbed the energy more readily without catastrophic failure, explaining the selective nature of the destruction. This technological advantage was now being rapidly scaled up and integrated into the broader Allied strategy, codenamed Operation Trident's Tip. General Thorne immediately ordered the production of hundreds of the new Deepstrike vessels, along with the modification of dozens of ships to serve as covert launch platforms. The element of surprise had worked brilliantly at Volkov, but Thorne knew that the enemy, though confused, was not foolish. They would eventually realize the attacks were systematic, not random acts of geological misfortune. The next set of targets, the heavily garrisoned Ethel Islands, represented an even greater challenge. Ethel was a vast archipelago, home to a chain of interlinked fortifications known as the Iron Shell Defense. Japanese forces there, under the command of the cunning General Motobu Kenji, were already on high alert, frantically trying to rationalize Volkov's demise. Kenji, suspicious of the official earthquake explanation, had ordered his engineers to start reinforcing the undersides of their bunkers, a desperate measure born of sheer paranoia, but one that showed he was grasping for an unseen threat. Professor Vance and her team worked to refine the Deepstrike technology, making the next generation of vessels smaller, faster, and equipped with enhanced magnetic signature suppression to counteract any new Japanese hydrophone technology. The ethical weight of their creation began to settle upon the project team. They were wielding a weapon that literally weaponized the Earth, collapsing defenses onto the men inside. While necessary to save Allied lives, the sheer, terrifying efficiency of the Deepstrike was a heavy burden. Vance spent sleepless nights agonizing over the collateral damage, but Thorne kept her focused on the casualty estimates for a conventional assault on Ethel, numbers that dwarfed the cost of Volkov. The secret order was transitioning from a desperate gamble to a full-scale, terrifying strategic tool, poised to strike at the heart of the enemy's remaining fortified defenses across the Pacific. The world was about to witness the true, devastating reach of a weapon born of science and secrecy. The operation against the Ethel Islands was executed with ruthless efficiency, but with a critical difference: General Thorne employed the Deepstrike vessels as a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Instead of targeting all defenses simultaneously, they focused on isolated, high-value command centers and key logistical hubs. This approach was designed not only to minimize enemy cohesion but also to maximize the psychological impact on the scattered garrisons. The attacks were spaced out over 4 days, striking at different islands within the chain, often in the middle of the night, leaving the Japanese perpetually guessing as to the enemy's next move. The unseen terror was being meticulously managed for maximum dread. On Ethel Major, the largest island, General Kenji's paranoia proved both his salvation and his undoing. His decision to reinforce the bunker floors did provide a small measure of temporary resistance to the initial wave of sonic vibration attacks, but it was too little, too late. The Deepstrike's improved power simply overcame the makeshift supports. When the main communications bunker collapsed, not explosively, but by a chilling implosion of its internal structure, Kenji barely escaped with his life, emerging to witness the complete failure of his defensive network. The sheer impossibility of the attacks drove him to a state of near madness. He issued confusing and contradictory orders, commanding his men to fight on the surface, then ordering them back into the tunnels, before finally commanding them to abandon their positions entirely. The Japanese High Command, thousands of miles away, was in chaos. They had received reports from Volkov and now the Ethel Islands detailing the same incomprehensible mode of destruction: massive, localized collapse without external sign of explosive force. Their top scientists posited wild theories, ranging from a new class of earthquake bomb dropped by undetectable high-altitude aircraft to geological sabotage by specially trained Allied infiltrators. The most damaging aspect of the secret weapon was that it consumed their focus, forcing them into a crippling state of strategic reaction. They began diverting critical resources, steel, cement, and engineers, away from frontline production to build experimental, anti-seismic defenses that were entirely untested and ultimately futile against the targeted resonance of the Deepstrike. This strategic misallocation was exactly what Thorne and Vance had hoped for. The enemy was defeated not just by the weapon, but by the mystery of the weapon itself. The Allied invasion force, having learned from Volkov, moved in with a new doctrine tailored to the psychological state of the Japanese defenders. They used loudspeakers broadcasting unnerving low-frequency sounds before every attack, deliberately mimicking the subtle initial hum of the Deepstrike. This sonic deception completely broke the will of many entrenched units. The combination of structural certainty and psychological terror made the Ethel campaign a textbook example of modern, asymmetrical warfare, proving that control over the unseen environment, the earth beneath their feet, was the new key to victory in the Pacific. The success of Operation Trident's tip against the Ethel Islands cemented the Deepstrike Vessels' place in military history. It had delivered a victory that was not merely strategic, but paradigmatic, fundamentally changing the nature of future conflict. The speed and relative low cost of the Ethel campaign, compared to the horrific projected cost of a conventional assault, provided General Thorne with irrefutable evidence that Project Leviathan was the definitive war-shortening technology. The islands that had been built as anchors for the Japanese defense line were now seen as liabilities, their own fortifications a threat to the men inside. Admiral Sato, having been captured and debriefed after the fall of Volkov, remained perplexed until shown the recovered footage and telemetry data from the Deepstrike launches. His initial disbelief turned to grudging respect for Professor Vance's revolutionary science. "We were not defeated by guns or courage, but by invisible tremors," he reportedly stated during his debriefing. "You made the Earth your weapon. It is a war we could never have prepared for." This assessment, circulated subtly through intelligence channels, further amplified the psychological defeat within the remaining enemy ranks. The spirit of suicidal resistance that had characterized the war's earlier stages began to wane, replaced by a sense of futility against a foe that could defy physics. Professor Vance, now heralded by the Allied command as a strategic genius, spent the remainder of the war perfecting the Deepstrike for deployment in other theaters. Her technology continued to be deployed judiciously, primarily as a tool of strategic demoralization and precise incapacitation of high-value targets, ensuring the enemy remained perpetually off balance. The need for massive, costly conventional assaults was dramatically reduced, saving countless Allied lives and accelerating the end of the conflict far sooner than any analyst had predicted. The Deepstrike vessel, the weapon Japan never expected and couldn't stop, ultimately ensured that the long, bloody progression of island hopping came to a swift, terrifying conclusion. The story of the secret World War II order and the Deepstrike vessels became a legend whispered among the Allied forces, a tale of how ingenuity, secrecy, and the audacity to challenge fundamental military assumptions led to an unprecedented victory. It stands as a chilling testament to the power of science in warfare, a reminder that the most devastating battles are sometimes fought not on the surface, but in the unseen depths, against an enemy's expectations. The weapon that attacked the foundation of defense was the weapon that finally broke the will of an empire, securing peace by harnessing the power of the earth itself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.